Good morning. It is Thursday, May 14th, 2026. This is your Deep Dive Daily Briefing. I am your anchor, delivering a comprehensive analysis of the pivotal events that have defined the last 24 hours. We begin our broadcast on the world stage, where the strategic landscape of the Middle East has reached a moment of maximum diplomatic peril. Overnight in Islamabad, Pakistan, mediators have intensified their efforts to salvage a fragile ceasefire that President Donald Trump recently described as being on massive life support. This dire assessment follows the White House's dismissal of Tehran's latest peace proposal, which the president characterized as fundamentally non-viable. While Pakistani officials maintain that both Washington and Tehran are seriously pursuing a diplomatic exit to avoid a full-scale resumption of war, the situation on the ground remains commercially paralyzed. The United States naval blockade of Iranian ports continues to neutralize the regime's maritime exports, while the Iranian Revolutionary Guard persists in its harassment and interdiction of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. Despite the ongoing deadlock, mediators indicate that Iran has reiterated a willingness to halt uranium enrichment for 5 years in exchange for an end to the blockade, though Washington continues to demand a more permanent 20-year moratorium and the dismantling of underground nuclear facilities.
Transitioning from the theater of diplomacy to the broader global economy, the shadow of this prolonged conflict is being formally quantified by the International Monetary Fund. In its supplementary analysis released this week, the IMF has solidified its 2026 global growth projection at a modest 3.1%, citing the structural damage caused by the largest energy supply disruption in nearly 50 years. The fund warns that if the conflict broadens or the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed, the global economy could face a persistent stagflationary trap. This economic drag is compounded by a surge in defense spending, which is rising by an average of 2.7 percentage points of GDP globally. While these outlays may provide a temporary boost to industrial activity, they are increasingly crowding out essential social spending and weakening the fiscal sustainability of both advanced and emerging economies, with the IMF projecting that public debt in conflict-affected nations could jump by 14 percentage points within 3 years.
In the realm of finance, all eyes have been on the United States Senate, which confirmed Kevin Warsh as the next chair of the Federal Reserve in a historic 54-45 vote on Wednesday. This development marks a monumental turning point in monetary policy, as Warsh officially takes the helm today, May 14, 2026, replacing outgoing Fed Chair Jerome Powell. The confirmation, which was the most divisive for this position in history, occurred largely along party lines. Warsh inherits a central bank facing historic internal division and an inflationary environment fueled by the ongoing Middle East crisis, with consumer prices recently climbing to 3.8% year-over-year. Institutional investors are bracing for a regime change, as Warsh has previously criticized the Fed's recent handling of inflation and called for a significant reduction in the central bank's $315 trillion global debt pool. Notably, Jerome Powell is expected to remain on the Fed's Board of Governors even after stepping down as chair, making him the first outgoing chief to do so in more than 7 decades.
Turning our attention to the technology sector, the focus remains on the massive infrastructure supercycle driven by the critical need for energy-independent artificial intelligence. Industry leaders have reached a consensus that energy infrastructure, rather than computing power, is now the primary constraint for AI development. Estimates suggest that data center energy consumption could approach 1,050 terawatt-hours by the end of this year, a figure that would make the sector the 5th largest energy consumer in the world if it were a country. In response, tech giants are aggressively pivoting toward on-site energy solutions to bypass a volatile global power grid and permitting delays that now stretch over a decade. The industry is seeing a surge in investments for high-performance chips designed for inference, which now accounts for up to 90% of AI computing power. This strategic shift highlights a new reality where technological leadership is increasingly dependent on securing the gigawatts of power necessary to sustain the agentic AI revolution.
Finally, we look at the logistics and supply chain networks that serve as the vital arteries of global commerce, which are now undergoing a permanent structural rewiring due to the ongoing maritime crisis. Since late February, commercial traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has been largely blocked, forcing the maritime industry to finalize its transition to the Cape of Good Hope as the primary route for Asia to Europe trade. This detour, which adds roughly 14 days to standard voyage times, has triggered the largest monthly increase in oil prices in history and is now impacting secondary commodity markets.
Logistics professionals report that emergency conflict surcharges of up to $4,000 per container have become standard, with overall freight indices having more than doubled. As shipping lines abandon the low-cost, just-in-time models of the past in favor of regional inventory buffers, the industry accepts a new reality of permanent cost premiums to insulate world trade from unpredictable geopolitical shocks.
In summary, the global landscape is defined by a fragile diplomatic opening in the Middle East that has stalled growth and a historic leadership transition at the Federal Reserve. Technological innovation is pivoting toward energy-independent infrastructure, while the global shipping industry settles into a high-cost, permanent detour around Africa. Based on the current data, I predict that the official takeover by Kevin Warsh today will serve as a definitive signal to the markets that the era of central bank accommodation is over. Even if a diplomatic breakthrough occurs in Islamabad, the structural inflation baked into the new regionalized logistics model and the massive capital redirection toward defense and energy-independent AI infrastructure will prevent a return to the low-interest rate environment of the previous decade. We are entering a cycle where resilience and national security will consistently outweigh the efficiencies of the old globalized order through the remainder of 2026.